Shabbat Shalom. So if you paid close attention to what Hannah was saying this morning in her Devar Torah, you know that we read the first book from the book of Numbers, the first Parsha in Sefer B'midbar. Now, if you've been following along from the beginning of the Torah, you know that every Sefer, every book, has a name in Hebrew and a name in English. And usually they don't match. Actually, they never match. Now, how do the books get their numbers? Their names, actually. The numbers is the name for this book. But how do they get their names? Well, Bereshit, it gets its name from the first word of the book in Hebrew, right? Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. So how does it get the name Genesis? How does Exodus get the name Exodus and Shemot in Hebrew? The first word of the Sefer in Hebrew is Shemot, so that's how it gets its Hebrew name. But how does it get the name Exodus? How does Leviticus get to be Leviticus and Vayikra in Hebrew? And how does B'midbar gets to be B'midbar in Hebrew and Numbers in English? So by now you should have figured it out. We call them in Hebrew by the first word in Hebrew. That's the way we named them originally. But in English, they're named after their Greek name, which was given to them by the thematic of the book. Now, this specific book, B'midbar, its English name, Numbers, is not named by its thematic because it's really not about numbers. It's about the wilderness. So it really should have been called Wilderness, but it's called Numbers. So there's a problem here. Why do they call it Numbers in English? It doesn't really match with the system. And I think the way in which it was named in Greek and then translated into English, Numbers, is onto something. I think, for once, the English name of the book is much more powerful than the Hebrew name. I know this is controversial, but it's very powerful. Numbers. Numbers are powerful. Numbers are unique. Numbers are the source of many things in life. And this week's Torah portion and this week's Sefer, this book of the Torah, begin with a tremendous emphasis of the power of numbers. So how do we begin? We begin in the wilderness. That's true. But we begin with the census. And what's the origin of this census? God asks through Moses to count the Jewish people. Count those men among the people over the age of 21 that can go to war. And this begs a question. If God is God and God is all-powerful and all-knowledgeable and knows it all and sees it all and is ever-present, why does God need a number? Why doesn't God just say to Moses, Moses, there's 600,000 among you that can go to war? Why don't we just save ourselves the tremendous exercise in counting? Why don't we just save ourselves the tremendous toil that it's going to take to assemble the people by tribe, by clan, by family? Let's just get over with and tell Moses the number. Because there's a tremendous amount of power in numbering people. Now, does this take away from the power of God? No, it doesn't. God can actually choose to reveal or not reveal whatever God wants to reveal. It happens time and time again in history and in our story as a people. But in this particular case, there's something that God is revealing to us through this method that's really powerful. Before we go into that, I want to share with you something incredible. I've been watching a really good TV show lately, which is called Touch, with Kiefer Sutherland. You know, he was on 24. Really good show, too. And Touch is about a man who has a son who's autistic. And one of the things about this little boy, whose name is Jake, is that he doesn't allow anyone to touch him. But the whole show gyrates about this notion that this little boy can connect people through numbers. Nobody can touch him, but he can touch others to the power of numbers. So he comes up with this number in his head. And through this unique number, people's lives get interconnected to each other. So through a specific number, he knows that someone here in one corner of the world is connected to somebody there in another corner of the world. And somehow their lives become better by knowing each other and interacting with that specific number. And so the power of numbers comes to shine in a beautiful way. So I recommend that show to you. And it teaches you that one number, one single number, can change a life and a lifetime and the course of history. And it also teaches you that sometimes people who cannot be touched by physical touch can touch others with their minds and their intentions in ways that we can't even possibly begin to imagine. But back to the Torah, about our number, 600,000 approximately. First of all, let's think about this reality. Because when we watch the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, and by the way, my favorite metaphor of all times, right? Charlton Heston is Moses. You can't separate it. If Charlton Heston is Moses, then who is he, right? He has to be Moses for Leolam Vaed. I can't get that out of my mind. But when you watch the Ten Commandments, how many people are there in the movie coming out of Egypt? Give me a number. Millions? Really? You see millions? I see a couple of thousand, right, on TV, but I don't see 600,000. I don't see even 1.5 million coming out of Egypt. In the movie The Prince of Egypt, in the cartoon, how many people do you see coming out of Egypt? I don't see millions. The reality is we never imagine millions coming out of Egypt. But if this number is true, we came into Egypt at 70,000 people, and we leave from Egypt millions. And that's an astounding number. So numbers do matter. So even in slavery, we really multiplied. We multiplied not only in number, but also in spirit, and also in intensity, and also in faith. And we leave Egypt not a people of slaves, but we leave Egypt truly a nation, a sovereign nation that is now ready to go to war. And this is one of the first metaphors that comes from counting ourselves in this census. But back to the counting. In studying with Hannah, I discovered something very important. And we talked about a man whose name was Nachmanides, the Ramban, who was born in Spain in the 13th century. He was a Torah commentator who was also a physician, by the way. And he really came up with an incredible answer to this question of why count ourselves. Why God doesn't just give us the answer. He came up actually with 3 different answers, which are very important answers. And by the way, don't ever buy into this notion that our commentators who live in the Middle Ages didn't have any of the answers that we seek in modernity. Because some of them were very sophisticated, actually, and I believe that had they lived today, they would have been conservative rabbis. Nachmanides actually said, there's 3 reasons why we count ourselves. Reason number 1, God wants to show us that A, every single person counts. That, yes, we are part of a community, but without individuals, there can be no community. B, yes, we are individuals, but if we're only individuals, there's also no community. Meaning, if you want to have a community, at some point, you have to stop being an individual. And 3, the most important one of all, God wants us to count ourselves because we have to, at one point, stop relying on miracles. Yes, God brought us out of Egypt. God showed us all these great signs, and He showed us all these great wonders. But God wants us to know that at one point, the story stops being only about God, and it has to become about ourselves. There's a point in history where we, as a people, need to take history in our hands and make it happen. And if we can't do that, history will never be ours to make, and it will always belong to others. And that's where we count ourselves. But perhaps the most important lesson, he says, is to teach Moses that Jewish leadership belongs to those who understand that the Jewish people needs to be counted and not to be treated like a mass. We need to understand that Moses as a leader needs to listen to the voices of the people, that we cannot send our people into war as any other people goes to war. Send them to die. No, we don't do that. Never. Each one of them has a family. Each one of them has children. Each one of them has a name. And that's what God is trying to get Moses to understand. It's a very important and powerful message. And that's why we begin with the census. And this is the first and powerful lesson of a sovereign nation. So we move on. And I want to share with you today 3 very, very beautiful stories. The first story about the power of one and how one person can make a difference and how an individual can make a difference comes from the Second World War. And it's not the story of a survivor. It's not the story of a Jewish person. It's a story of a man who was not Jewish. José Arturo Castellanos. And I don't know if you've heard this name before. I'm sure you've heard the name of Raoul Wallenberg. You know who Wallenberg was? Most of you have heard Wallenberg, right? So Raoul Wallenberg saved 100,000 Jews. He was a Swedish diplomat who gave 100,000 Jews Swedish documents. Castellanos was a Salvadorian diplomat who gave 40,000 Jews in Hungary Salvadorian documents, Salvadorian passports, and saved their lives. This story is very little known. He was just made a righteous Gentile by Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. And by the way, as part of the new institute that we started here at Temple Bet Shalom, under the Waltzinger Learning Center for Adults, we're going to have a big exhibit on his life and what he did. Because I think that if you really understand what this man did, it was nothing short of a miracle. From El Salvador, a country that's, by the way, close to the same, if not smaller in size than Israel, a man who had never seen a Jew in his life saved 40,000 Jews during the war. The story is told that when they went up to the Germans with their passports from El Salvador, the Germans said to them, "Where is this country? What is this?" And the Jews, they said, "In Africa." And the Germans said, "Okay, go." Nobody had any idea, but he saved their lives. That's a story of a person, one in millions, who did something to help. That's why we count. And that's what being counted is all about. That's the power of numbers. And here's another story. This story comes from the Jerusalem Post last week about the liberation of Jerusalem during the Six-Day War. The story of a man by the name of David Wilensky, who now lives in Jerusalem, who's a doctor in Jerusalem. He tells a story of how when he was a student at the Hebrew University during the Six-Day War, when they first heard that the war was breaking out and people were vacating the dorms of the university, the Jordanian radio started transmitting the news that they were going to start marching towards the other side of Jerusalem. And the Jewish students started fleeing the campus. And some of the Arab students and some of the foreign students decided to stay. And Jordanian radio, after they played some songs, would start saying, "This is for all of you Zionists out there," in English. And then they would play the sounds of machine guns. They fled. Many of the students went to Kibbutz Ein Tzurin. And after the war was over, when they returned to the campus, and they found that nothing had happened in the campus, they found their stuff was there, that all of the other students were not there, and they were able to take their stuff back, and they were able to go back to school and learn. They understood what it meant to be part of a people. They understood what it meant to be able to go back to being, to becoming, to building. Because even though they felt that they were totally alone at one point, they felt what it meant to be embraced by a community of people they didn't even know in a kibbutz that took them in, only to go back to their own lives and be embraced yet again by the bulk of Israeli society as they went back to their lives. Which reminded me of another story. When I used to teach at Park Avenue Synagogue in New York, there was a man by the name of Zev Shanken, who was another one of the teachers, about 15 years older than me, 20 years older than me, who's a poet and a teacher, who was in the first Pan Am flight of American Jewish volunteers going to Israel after the war broke out in '67. He told a story that as a pilot was about to enter, I would say, Greek airspace, they got a report that Israel was completely taken over by Arab forces, because there was a period of about 15 minutes that Ben-Gurion stopped transmitting the airport for security reasons. And so the Arab airwaves took over the air. But the pilot, who was Jewish, decided not to stop or turn back. He kept on going. And everybody in that plane was Jewish. There were journalists and Jewish volunteers. And they were very, very nervous. And they were able to land. And Israel was there. And there was no problem. And everything was fine. And he tells a story that when they landed, the majority of them kissed the ground. And when they got off the plane, they all danced. And they all prayed. And they all hugged each other. And they had this feeling again of being part of a people, of being part of a whole, of not being alone. This is why numbers matter. This is why being counted matters. Because you're an individual, but you're also part of a whole. You know, I often think about those of us who walk through the world branded with numbers on our hands, on our arms. And I often wonder what it meant when the Nazis tried to do this to us. And if they knew that many, many years later, instead of taking that as an act of defeat and destruction, we would see that number as a sign of survival and hope. For us as Jews, numbers are sacred. They're just not numbers. They're not just for mathematics or equations. They're a sign of survival. And for us as Jews, survival is not just about being alive. You see, 2,000 plus years of history are not just about being alive. We keep our synagogues open, our institutions going, not because they have to be here, but because they serve a mission and a purpose. We're not about just being. We are about understanding and being part of a purpose and serving a mission. And by the way, the day that stops, we stop. So keep the numbers going. Not because we add them up, but because we make up the number. Shabbat Shalom u'mevorach.